Warning, dear listeners, this story contains sensitive content that may harm vulnerable people or those with an unstable psyche. I want to warn you that the story is strictly 18 plus. And also remember that the author of the channel condemns any steps towards ending one's life by oneself. There are no problems that cannot be solved. And now, enjoy your viewing. I work as a forester, where the desperate take their last steps. There are strange rules to follow. I've always loved nature. It was my escape from the chaos of the world, from the endless noise of people, from the constant hum of life that never seemed to stop. The forest felt like a sanctuary, a place where I could hear my own thoughts, where even the wind whispered secrets through the branches. Since childhood, I had dreamed of living among the trees, far from civilization. After graduating with a degree in forestry, I started searching for a job. I wanted something real, something more than just sitting in an office pushing papers. I wanted to be a ranger, not just a caretaker of the trees, but someone who understood them, someone who protected nature from people and people from nature. That's how I found this job. I was assigned to the deep forests of Mount Hood National Park in Oregon. Wild, ancient woods stretched for hundreds of miles, their dense canopies casting shadows over winding trails. My post was near a small town called Estacada, a place that felt completely disconnected from the rest of the world. When I arrived, I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. They told me I'd be working under a veteran ranger, an old man who had spent nearly his entire life in this forest. His name was George Hudson. The locals simply called him Old George. I wasn't sure if it was out of respect or just habit, but when people mentioned his name, there was always something else in their voices, an undercurrent of unease. George met me at the edge of the forest, near a weathered wooden cabin that looked like it had been plucked straight from another century. He was tall and wiry, his face lined with deep wrinkles, his eyes dark as the night itself. They weren't cold, exactly, just tired. Like he had seen too much. "You the new guy?" His voice was low and rough, like gravel scraping against stone as he gave me a once-over. "Yeah. I'm Alex Carlisle," I answered. "All right," he nodded. "You'll work with me until you learn the ropes. Then, if you're lucky, you'll move on. If you're not..." He trailed off, glancing toward the trees before muttering, "We'll see." His words unsettled me, but I chalked it up to an old man's gruff attitude. George wasted no time taking me on a patrol. We walked along narrow trails that twisted and disappeared between towering trees. He moved through the forest like he belonged there, like he was a part of it, while I struggled to keep up. He talked as we walked, pointing out different animals, explaining which plants were safe and which were poisonous. "Wolves, bears, lynxes," he said, gesturing toward the trees. "But they're not your biggest concern. They stay away from people. It's the tourists and poachers you gotta worry about." I listened carefully, trying to memorize everything. The forest was breathtaking, tall pines stretching toward the sky, the distant hoot of an owl, the wind whispering through the branches. But something felt off. Too quiet. George suddenly stopped. "You notice it?" he asked. "Notice what?" "The silence. No birds, no insects. That's never a good sign." A shiver ran down my spine as I stared into the dark spaces between the trees, but I saw nothing. Just shadows. "Let's head back," he said quickly, turning on his heel. I didn't argue. When we returned to the cabin, George gave me a quick tour. The place was old but sturdy. The wooden floors creaked under our steps. The living room had a heavy wooden table, an ancient fireplace, and shelves stacked with dusty books. "Kitchen's here," he pointed. "Your room's down the hall. If you want to stay the night, you can use it." Then he led me to a small, cluttered office. Papers were scattered across the desk, but what caught my attention was the massive map of the forest hanging on the wall. Small red lights blinked in various locations. "Motion sensors," George explained. "They only go off when something moves out there. Tourists, lost hikers, poachers. Not animals?" I asked. "No. They're set to ignore them." I studied the map as the tiny red dots flickered. George stared at it too, his jaw tight, his expression unreadable. On the wall beside the map hung 3 rifles. They looked old, but well maintained. Those for protection? I asked. A slow smile crept onto George's face. From people? Yeah. I didn't press further, but something about his answer made my skin crawl. Before I could ask anything else, George turned to me with a more serious expression. There are a few rules you need to remember, he said. Most important one, after your first night, you'll never want to stay here long term. At the time, I had no idea what he meant. I had no idea how much those rules would change my life. That evening, after a long patrol through the forest, we sat in the small kitchen of the cabin, drinking tea and eating a simple but filling meal. The lamp above the table crackled softly, while outside, the thick darkness slowly swallowed the last remnants of twilight. George looked deep in thought. He was quieter than usual, as if weighing something in his mind. Then, with a deep sigh, he reached into an old drawer and pulled out a worn leather notebook. His fingers lingered on the cover, as if hesitating to open it, but eventually, he lifted his eyes and fixed me with a serious gaze. Listen carefully, Alex. This is important. His voice was dry, stripped of its usual gruffness. If you want to stay here and not disappear without a trace, you'll need to remember a few rules. I wiped my hands on a napkin and nodded. I hadn't thought that a ranger's life required special instructions, but something in his tone made me pay attention. George flipped through the notebook until he found the right page. His fingers trembled slightly. First, between 1 a.m. and sunrise, you do not leave the cabin. No matter what. No matter what you hear or think you see. If something is outside the door, it's none of your business. I frowned slightly but said nothing. George's eyes remained on the page as he continued. Second, from 3 to 4 a.m., you may hear knocking, crying, laughter, or voices begging for help. Ignore them. Never go to the windows, and for the love of God, don't open the door. A chill crawled up my spine. There was something unsettling about the way he spoke, something that made me glance at the clock. It was still early, but I already felt less sure of myself than I had a few minutes ago. Third, George continued, if, during a patrol, you see a little girl in a white dress, do not approach her. Just turn around and walk back to the cabin. And most importantly, do not look back. No matter what. Goosebumps spread across my skin. A heavy knot formed in my stomach. Fourth, if a motion sensor light goes off, you need to check it. It might save a life. But if it happens between 1 a.m. and sunrise, ignore it. Whatever's out there, it's not your problem. I opened my mouth to ask something, but George was already flipping to the last page. And finally, the fifth rule. If you ever notice something strange or start feeling lost, stop. Close your eyes, say "I am alive" 3 times, and walk back toward the cabin. Your instincts will lead you home. I sat in silence, absorbing what I had just heard. My heart pounded in my chest. Was this some kind of joke? Or just a way to scare me into being careful? But George didn't look like he was joking. There was something in his expression, something close to fear. Not just caution, but real fear. That's all? I asked dryly, trying to mask my unease. Yes. George closed the notebook inside. Just follow the rules, Alex. And you'll be fine. That night, I couldn't sleep. Lying in my room, I listened to the forest. The wind rustled through the branches, a wolf howled in the distance, but the thing that unsettled me most was the silence. A deep, unnatural silence that blanketed the forest, swallowing even the smallest sounds. The next morning, I told George the first wanted to stay longer. He only nodded. All right. But I'll be watching you. Don't do anything stupid, and follow the rules. And so, my life in the forest began. I worked, I helped George, I learned the land. But most importantly, I committed every rule to memory. Because deep down, I knew they weren't written for nothing. Weeks passed, and I started to settle into life in the forest. The morning and evening patrols became routine, though something inside me always felt on edge. I still couldn't get used to how deep the silence was here, as if the forest was hiding something. But nothing truly unusual had happened until that foggy evening. George and I were sitting in the kitchen, sipping hot tea, discussing the usual things: the state of the forest, animal tracks, tourists who ignored marked trails. The wind howled outside, and thick fog wrapped around everything, making the night feel even more impenetrable. George was in the middle of telling a story about an old ranger who used to work here when a sharp sound rang out from the office. The siren. I jolted upright, spilling some tea, while George silently stood up. His face didn't show surprise, just a weary resignation. I shot him a questioning look. "Another one," he muttered. "Another what?" I asked, but he was already heading toward the office. I quickly followed and saw him staring at the map. One of the motion sensors was blinking a bright red, marking something deep in the forest. "We need to go," he said, grabbing a flashlight. I checked the clock. 12:05 a.m. Less than an hour before we had to be back. The darkness in the forest was nearly absolute. Our flashlights cut through the void, illuminating only small patches of ground ahead. We moved quickly, silently, with only the wind rustling in the treetops. At some point, I raised my beam a little higher, and my heart nearly stopped. A noose dangled from one of the branches. It swayed slightly in the breeze, as if someone had just touched it. Cold sweat trickled down my back. "George." "Keep walking," he said curtly, not even turning his head. I wanted to ask what the hell was going on, but something in his voice kept me from questioning him. We walked further, and I started seeing more of them. Some old and rotting, others fresh. One had a torn piece of fabric hanging from it. I realized I was terrified of seeing one that wasn't empty. And then, when we finally reached the motion sensor, my fear became reality. A body dangled high above us, swinging gently with the wind. George calmly pulled his rifle from his shoulder, aimed, and fired. The rope snapped, and the body collapsed into the damp leaves below. I froze, unable to move. "Don't look it in the eyes," George said quietly. I pressed my lips together and averted my gaze, though every instinct in me screamed that this wasn't right. George walked over, pulled a rag from his pocket, and covered the face of the dead man. "What the hell is going on here?" I finally forced out. George looked at me, his expression heavy with something close to sorrow. "This forest doesn't let go of those who come here to die. And those who do don't always leave." He grabbed the body by the shoulders and dragged it off the path into the undergrowth. I wanted to protest, to say we needed to call the police, but the words caught in my throat. George was already walking back toward the cabin. "We don't report it. It's better this way," he said flatly, not even looking at me. On the way back, he told me the truth about the forest. People had always come here to end their lives. The authorities installed motion sensors in the hopes of stopping the tragedies before they happened. But over the years, more and more incidents occurred. And now, the forest held onto their shadows, their whispers lingering in the night. "The souls that haven't found peace remain here," George said as the cabin lights finally came into view. "That's why you follow the rules." We made it back 5 minutes before 1. George locked the door without a word, while I sat on my bed, feeling the cold weight of fear settle over me. But George seemed calm, as if this was just another part of his routine. I tried to convince myself that it was just one awful, isolated incident. But deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. A week had passed since that horrifying patrol. I tried not to think about the body in the forest, the ropes swaying from the branches, or the somber look in George's eyes. But the memories refused to fade, resurfacing every time the twilight swallowed the woods. That night, a storm raged over us. Rain poured relentlessly, the wind howled through the trees, snapping branches and making the cabin creak as if unseen hands were squeezing it. George and I sat by the old fireplace, the flickering flames casting eerie shadows on the walls. I tried to focus on the crackling wood, to keep my mind from wandering to what lurked outside. The clock read 3:05 a.m. when the first knock came. I snapped my head up. A slow, rhythmic pounding against the wooden door. As if someone was standing outside in the storm, patiently waiting. I started to rise, but George's hand clamped around my wrist. His grip was strong, his gaze sharp with urgency. "Don't," he whispered. "That's not a person." The knocking stopped. A silence stretched through the cabin. And then, something shifted. The lights flickered. The lamp above the table trembled as if shaken by invisible hands. The air felt heavier, pressing against my chest. And then I heard it. A sob. A muffled, heart-wrenching sob, like a lost child crying somewhere in the dark. Then, the sound of bare feet slapping against wet ground. Quick, frantic footsteps darting around the cabin. And then, the voices. A whisper, urgent and desperate, just outside the window. "Please, help me." My heart pounded. I couldn't help myself. I turned toward the window. In an instant, George shoved me to the floor. "Don't look," he snarled, his voice more animal than human. "Stay down. Don't move." I held my breath, crouched behind an overturned chair. But something inside me still pulled, still beckoned. My gaze drifted sideways. And I saw them. Through the streaks of rain on the window, illuminated by a flash of lightning, dozens of figures hung from the trees outside. They didn't just hang. They swayed. Their heads lolled to one side, their limbs twitching as if struggling against unseen forces. Their hollow eye sockets were like endless voids, empty and devouring. I couldn't look away. George lunged, grabbing me and forcing my face to the ground. "Don't look them in the eyes," he hissed. "If you look too long, they'll notice. And then you'll join them." I clenched my eyes shut, trying to erase the images burned into my mind. My breath came in sharp gasps, my heart hammering against my ribs. The footsteps outside didn't stop. The voices melded into a garbled chorus, an unintelligible hum of pleading and despair. They were waiting. Time dragged unbearably. We sat frozen in the dark, too afraid to move. Around 4 a.m., everything stopped. The whispers faded. The figures outside vanished with the first hints of dawn. The storm subsided. We were still alive. I sat up in silence, running my hands over my face. George let out a long breath and stood, shooting me a tense glance. "Add a new rule, Alex," he said. "Never look into the eyes of the ones already hanging. If you do, they'll take you with them." I shivered, pulled out my notebook, and wrote it down. My hands were still shaking, but one thing was clear: these rules weren't just superstition. They were the only thing keeping us alive. A few days had passed since the last incident. I had grown accustomed to my evening patrols. They had become part of my life here. But on this particular night, something felt different. The forest was too quiet. The wind didn't rustle the tree branches, and the only sound I could hear was my own breathing and the muted crunch of twigs beneath my boots. I felt watched, constantly, but I saw no one. At 11 p.m., I was making my way back along the trail when I saw a silhouette. A little girl in a white dress stood in the middle of the path, her shoulders trembling as if she were crying. Ice shot through my veins. The rule flashed in my mind: don't approach. Don't speak. Don't look back. I took a deep breath, turned sharply, and walked in the opposite direction. My heartbeat was so loud it seemed to echo through the trees. But the worst part wasn't the girl. The worst part was the whispering that began the moment I turned away. Soft, drawn-out voices whispered unintelligible words from every direction, sending a deep, primal fear surging through my body. I clenched my teeth, forcing myself to move faster. The dry branches of the undergrowth felt like fingers reaching out to grab me. When I finally made it back to the cabin, George was sitting on the porch. Calmly sipping his tea, he didn't even seem fazed by the terrified look on my face. "I saw her," I gasped, still catching my breath. George slowly set his cup down and nodded. "Good. You came back alive. That means you did everything right." But somehow, his words didn't bring me any relief. That night, I couldn't sleep. Something gnawed at me, a crushing sense of unease. The room was dark, but I knew I wasn't alone. Then, at exactly 3:33 a.m., a loud crash echoed from George's room. I held my breath, trying to calm myself. Maybe he knocked something over? Maybe it was the wind? But my heart was already racing. Slowly, carefully, I got up and crept toward his door. It was slightly open. I hesitated, then nudged it wider. And my blood ran cold. George's body was hanging from a rope. His feet dangled inches above the floor, a chair lying on its side beneath him. His head was tilted, and his eyes were staring directly at me. I rushed forward, my hands shaking as I struggled to get him down. His body was ice cold, too cold. I lowered him gently, trembling, and closed his lifeless eyes. Then I saw it. A note, lying on the table. With shaky fingers, I picked up the small, crumpled piece of paper and smoothed it out. Now, you are the one responsible for this forest. The most important thing, do not look them in the eyes. I stood there, listening to my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, mixing with the soft rustling of the wind outside. I didn't understand. George wasn't the type of man to do this. He was strong, resilient. Maybe he feared the forest, but he had never given in to it. My hands still trembling, I stepped out of his room and shut the door behind me. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, lying awake, staring at the ceiling. The thought of George's lifeless body in the next room nearly paralyzed me with fear. When dawn finally broke, I forced myself to go back to his room. But to my absolute horror, it was empty. The overturned chair remained. The rope lay on the floor beside it. But George's body was gone. The night after George's body disappeared was the most terrifying of my life. I lay in my room, staring at the ceiling, trying to force myself not to think about what had happened. But it was impossible. My mind was spinning with questions I had no answers to. Where had the body gone? What the hell was happening here? Did he really do it to himself? The wind howled outside, rattling the trees with an eerie force. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, but each sound echoed in my skull like it was counting down to something dreadful. I turned onto my side, shut my eyes, and forced myself to breathe evenly. Silence. Then, a knock. Dear friends, please do not forget to subscribe to the channel. I dream of 1,000 subscribers very much. A dull, heavy sound that echoed through the cabin. One knock. Then another. 3 slow, deliberate thuds against the wooden door. I froze. My heart pounded erratically, chaotically. I remembered what George had told me, don't open the door. It's not people. The knocking came again. And again. Slow, methodical. I carefully peeked out from under my blanket and glanced at the clock. 3:33 a.m. And then, I heard the voice. Open up, Alex. It's me. A cold wave of terror crashed over me. George's voice. Raspy, exhausted, but unmistakably his. My fingers clenched the fabric of my blanket. I forced myself to breathe quietly, as if he could hear me inside. Come on, kid. Stop hiding. The porch creaked. Footsteps circled the cabin. I clenched my teeth like that could somehow protect me. The light in my room flickered. Then I heard something else, a whisper, faint but coming from everywhere at once. And footsteps. Many footsteps. I gathered my courage, stood up, and, like I was under some kind of spell, moved toward the window. The wind howled. The lamp beside me trembled. I looked outside and nearly screamed. The trees were full of bodies. Dozens of them. Swinging like lifeless puppets, their empty eyes locked onto the cabin. And in the center of them all, George. He hung from a tree right outside my window. His eyes glowed an unnatural, burning red. He didn't move. He just stared. And I couldn't look away. Something inside me cracked. Alex, he whispered. "You're almost here." My breathing turned shallow. The world blurred. My mind unraveled, drowning in a flood of sheer terror. I lost track of time, lost my sense of reality. I didn't know how long it lasted until I realized I was standing on a chair. In my hands, I clutched a rough rope. The other end was looped around my throat. I didn't remember climbing up. Didn't remember grabbing it. Everything was a haze. What am I doing? The thought barely surfaced in my mind. With a gasp, I ripped the rope off and crashed onto the floor, gasping for air. My head spun, my vision blurred. I couldn't stay here any longer. At dawn, before the sun had even fully risen, I packed my things. I didn't stop to say goodbye. I didn't look back. As I started my car and drove away from the forest, the thick fog seemed to part before me, as if letting me go. I didn't know what had happened in that cursed forest. But I knew one thing: I would never go back. I didn't stop driving until I reached the city. The whole time, I felt like someone, or something, was following me. The forest, shrouded in its endless mist, was behind me, but its echo lingered in my mind. I didn't know what to do. I had escaped. But from what exactly? Ghosts? Madness? Myself? I rented a cheap motel room, locked the door, bolted the windows, and sat on the bed for hours, staring at the ceiling. Sleep wouldn't come. The things I had seen, they couldn't have been real. But I had seen them. Felt the icy touch of fear on my skin. I needed answers. The next morning, I drove to the local library. I needed records, old newspaper clippings, anything about that forest. Something inside me told me this hadn't started recently. I pulled stacks of newspaper archives from the last few decades and began digging through them. The headlines made my hands tremble. Disappearances in the forest continue, local authorities powerless. Suicides in the woods, another tragedy in the abandoned ranger cabin. Local ranger found dead. Mysterious circumstances. But then, one headline stopped me cold. Ranger George Hudson found hanged in his cabin. 10 years ago today. A crushing weight settled on my chest. My breath hitched as I reread the name. George. The same George. I scanned the article frantically. The body of Ranger George Hudson was discovered in his cabin. Authorities ruled it a suicide, but locals claimed the place has long been cursed. My body refused to believe it, but my mind had already put the pieces together. I had worked with a dead man. The person I knew as George had already been buried for a decade. I had eaten meals with him, heard his voice, followed him through the trees. But he had been dead the whole time. I grabbed the newspaper, my eyes fixed on the faded photograph. The same face stared back at me. The same deep wrinkles, the same grim expression. And then, I understood. I hadn't escaped. I had just survived. For now. I didn't want to know anything more about that forest. About its rules. About its ghosts. I crumpled the newspaper and walked out of the library, leaving the past behind me. The forest would never call me back. And I would never be a ranger again. Friends, write your impressions of the story in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe and like us to get more content like this.